It's about empowering chefs and empowering people to be having those conversations with, and they can stand behind them and they understand and they've got the tools to spend exploring and doing the what if, rather than just trying to gather all the bits of paper together and desperately hoping that they've got it right.
Welcome to the O for Food's Sake podcast, where we unwrap the joys and struggles of working in the food industry so you can thrive in what you do best while sustaining a rewarding and fulfilling career or business. We are your hosts, Lucy Wager, food industry consultant,
and Amy Wilkinson, food industry coach. We've worked in the food industry for the last 20 years and we're here to share with you the benefit of our hindsight. Our podcast is for you to find new ways to cope with the daily struggles, but mostly to inspire you to work on what's not working to ultimately improve your career or business long term.
Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of O for Food's Sake. Today we've got two guests with us. So I'm really excited to introduce you to David Moore, who is Group Head of ESG for the Compleat Food Group, and also Will Telford, who is Chief Technology and Product Officer for Point74, which is widely known across the industry as Recipe Professor. So welcome to you both.
Welcome.
Nice to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this episode because it feels like the culmination of quite a lot of conversations, but also something that I've been sort of involved in for quite a long time. So to set the scene, about 4 years ago, I worked on some lifecycle analysis projects. And it was right at the start of sort of understanding carbon emissions and working out product life cycles. And it was an absolute eye-opener and nightmare because I was asking questions that were really difficult to get the answers to, trying to get data. And it was really, really interesting. And that set off this interest for me about how this is going to get bigger. It needs to be easier to get this information. But also I learned some really interesting things that a small amount of ingredient that has a high impact can have a massive impact on a product overall. And it got me thinking about product development, thinking we need to understand this in a better way. Why isn't there a calculator like we use for nutritionals? Something like that needs to happen. So fast forward a couple of years on from that, and I had a conversation, did some work with Point74 and Will, and we had that conversation. And that set in motion, the wheels, is that the right way of saying it? Why we're here today and what we're going to talk about. So that was a very long-winded introduction, but I will now hand over to Will and to David to talk a bit more detail around what that actually means and what Point74 have been working on and how they've been working with Compleat.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, Lucy, it's great to be here. And I think the seed that you set that when we first met that time has just really led us down such a different path. I mean, I think it was eye-opening, the amount of information that you were having to collect to do an LCA on a life cycle assessment on a single product. And the fact that was taking you maybe a month just to get the data together, to get the answer, it felt like such a magnitude harder than what they're already trying to deal with in the food industry. And we know how difficult it is today just to get specifications and design food and launch products and the timeframes that people have to work to and the pressure they're under and with the competitive sort of retailer landscape that we have. So it just felt like this is a big ask. This is going to be a real difficult thing for food manufacturers to do at scale. And it just set us on a journey. And I think we started, it was around that time we were hearing so much noise from the rest of the industry around how are we going to do this? The retailers are asking them questions, companies are making commitments for net zero, etc. And I think it was just a real challenge for the industry. And we've been doing this for 17 years now, trying to help people to do nutritional calculations, to work out what back-of-pack claims look like, to what allergens are in a product, what it's going to cost to manufacture. And this just felt like another magnitude harder. And most companies are still struggling to do those things, to be honest. So it was then that we came across some of our customers like Compleat Food and David, who had sort of trying to solve this and had found other platforms and other software providers who were able to help them. And we just saw the opportunity to sort of join the two together. And it's been that journey we've been on, which has enabled us now to sort of embed environmental design as another module in our solution. So, I mean, probably David's pretty best to talk a little bit around the software that he came across and the journey that they've been on as a business there. But
yeah, that would be great. David, if you give us a bit of an insight into where you were and what you were doing at Compleat and what the journey that you've been on with Point 74, that'd be great.
Thanks, Lucy. And again, like Well said, it's great to be here. And so Compleat, a relatively young company. We're only just over 3 years old as a business. And like Will said, lots of companies setting grand ambitions, and we've now got validated science-based targets where we're doing all the things you'd expect a big, nearly billion turnover food company to be doing. And actually, kind of a similar time frame ago to you, Lucy, when you started to look into LCA, it was about 3 years ago that we first kind of dabbled in LCA as a business, and it was with the pastry side of our business, and we had a grand ambition to create the world's first net zero sausage roll, which we still have very much at the back of our minds and what we want to do. But it was a really manual process, the LCA process, and it took time. It took a lot of effort to get there, lots of questionnaires, kind of pinging back to and from our suppliers and validation of the data. But we were able to do it. We got to a total kind of carbon footprint of our wall sausage roll brand, one particular recipe produced out of one site that goes across 10 SKUs, just over 9,000 tons of CO2 equivalent, and which was great. We could look at a credible roadmap to net zero. We could look at, if we wanted to, making that brand carbon neutral by going into purchase credits and offsets. But we realized quite quickly that we couldn't scale it. So it just so happened we did this work in the August of 2022. And in the January, that Walls brand was going through a complete redesign. So new ingredients, new recipes, everything. And we went, we're going to have to do this again. We're going to do the manual process again. So we realized quite quickly that we couldn't scale it and that we wouldn't be able to use that manual process across the rest of our both branded and actually more importantly, probably our own branded portfolio, which is 80% of what Compleat produce. So
and I guess the thing with own label as well is that there was a lot more churn, isn't there? That's my assumption in terms of, so there's constantly new iterations of products which are going to throw that data off straight away.
Yeah, absolutely. Lucy mentioned kind of nutritional. So we will be kind of, depending on the brief, we'll be changing those products on a pretty regular basis, particularly in chilled kind of convenience food that we mainly play. And slightly different if it's an ambient grocery product. So I think there was a lot of headwinds for us that we needed to reach out and find out who were the players in this space, who was doing LCA at scale using technology. And that was what we did. And we ended up finding a company called Sustained, who we partnered with. We did a proof of concept, and a bit like Will said, you end up then trying to work out how you join the dots. How do you get from really challenging low quality data in spreadsheets, in Word documents, in PDFs? How do you get that into an electronic format that you can then do LCA at scale? And quite quickly start to realize that having done the proof of concept the manual way, using those kind of PDFs, that was difficult. So how could we then make this a more robust kind of data-driven process? And it just so happened that the pastry part of our business had been working with Point 74 and using the Recipe Professor system at a couple of our sites. And we made the decision as a group to roll out Recipe Professor to all of our in-house facilities. And then the answer became fairly clear. It was, we needed to use Recipe Professor as that authoritative source of truth for the data to drive the LCA. And that's where the partnership started.
And that project that we've been on with Compleat Food Group has really been to take them away from using spreadsheets and various other sort of disconnected systems. You know, they've got specs over here, and you've got new product development working over here with little calculators and costing models over there, and all of that challenge of trying to keep everyone connected, and lots of people doing lots of manual roles basically, and getting information too late in the process and putting it all into one platform, which has been a really challenging task. Just getting the data, you know, literally inputting 3,000, 5,000 ingredients or whatever, you know, putting teams on that, lining all the recipes, building processes in the system to keep that data live. So it's not just a one-off shop. It's going to, you know, keep being updated as new ingredients come in, as recipes go on and off production. And then, you know, the value of that data becomes apparent, because suddenly you can pass information that David needs for his LCA calculations into platforms like Sustained Impact, and we can get that answer straight back. And we can put that in the hands of the chefs at those very brief windows when they're being asked, design me a new product, and you've only got 3 weeks and we've got to launch it in a few months' time. And, you know, it's such a brief window of opportunity you've got, really.
And I think it's those things as well, like Lucy mentioned, where, you know, like a tiny ingredient can make such a big difference that I don't like to call people an NPD layman because we're not, but, you know, in ESG terms and understanding carbon footprint, we are. And it's really hard to know, you know, we're already trying to keep like the cost of everything in our head and stuff like that, which obviously Recipe Professor helps with. but it's like another layer, isn't it?
And it's not even, layman. Nobody knows what the impact is until the assessment's done. And the more you do, the more you start to think, oh, I wonder if that would be similar to this ingredient because I know the process is slightly similar. But from a product development perspective, doing these LCAs, you start to learn about processes within the industry, like in the ingredients sector, that you didn't know anything about before. So it really opens your eyes. And I think, at a time where everything is under such scrutiny and, development teams are under scrutiny in terms of how clean ingredients are, how carbon emitting they are, it's really difficult. And you need something that does pull everything together to help you make informed decisions and, support you in the development process, because there's so many things to consider and you've still got to make it taste great at the end of it. Also taking all of these things into account. So for me, it feels like this type of thing will become an essential tool eventually, because you can't do it quickly. As you said, David, you can do it, but it just takes a long time. And then by the time you've done it, it's out of date because you might need to change one small ingredient.
Yeah, and we could spend this entire podcast talking about the actual LCA process itself and how complicated that is. Like that is not a simple thing to get your head around, and it is evolving and the methodologies are improving, but you have to start somewhere. And what we're doing with the partnership between Point 74 and Sustained is we're using the data we have at our fingertips. So it's the data we put into those retail specs. It's the data we have from our ingredient suppliers. We're putting effectively what we're calling first party data into the LCA, and that gives us a really good starting point. So to your point about looking at ingredients that you wouldn't have seen have an impact, in the proof of concept we did with Sustained, we used 3 of our brands. We used Walls, we used Squeaky Bean, and we used Vidas. And actually Squeaky Bean being a vegan brand, we were pretty adamant it was going to come out, every product was going to be green when it came to the labeling. But we had a chorizo product produced out in Spain through one of our main chorizo partners, kind of made in the same kind of traditional process, but using vegan ingredients. Well, it should be really kind of low impact because it's vegan. They're all plant-based ingredients. There's no methane coming from animal protein. And it came out as not green and being like, what's driving this? And it's because it's produced in Spain and they haven't got a lot of water. Water is a scarce resource out there. And because we were doing this work with Sustained, we were looking at 16 different impact categories. If we'd have just been looking at carbon, we'd have missed the water impact. And suddenly it just opens up the impact you can have in a greater scale. And I think, almost to your point, Amy, it's really difficult to translate into something on a day-to-day basis that the development teams across Compleat and other businesses can make a decision on. And I don't want to make every one of my MPD colleagues an expert on kind of carbon accounting, quite frankly. It's hard enough doing that as an ESG team. But what we wanted to do is embed this LCA work in their day-to-day. So surface it in recipe professors so they can have visibility of when those recipes are being developed, either through reformulation, through EPD or through MPD. You can see the impact that the product has really, really simply. And then as we start to get better data in from our suppliers, so when we start to get information from them about the impact of that ingredient, they can start making some decisions. So they can say, are we going to work with a more regenerative source of pork because they're lower impact? Yes or no. But the important thing is we can cost it, and we can then say to our customers, whether it's branded or private label, we can do this. It's going to benefit us, but it's going to benefit you guys. It's going to reduce your Scope 3 emissions. How do you want to do this? Do we do a new range? Do we do something entirely different? Or do we try and work out a way over the next 5-10 years of gradually improving that over time? So it just gives a lot more ability for us to make decisions with this broader kind of environmental lens, which has never been there before.
And it just to the points on some points there, I think so much of the impact, typically around 80% is the materials that are arriving at the factory door, not anything you're doing in the factory. Not you can buy the greenest energy and have the best machines and the best processes, but most of the impact is the materials. It's embodied in and most of that's at the farming stage. And it is about those good regenerative farming practices and water usage, land usage. Something like 70% of fresh water globally goes into food manufacturing. And food production. It's huge consumers. So we've got to get this right. And it's definitely a journey. The first thing we look at is getting what we call the first party data, the quantities of the materials, the amount of ingredients you're using, the the specifications of those materials, of what's the supply chain look like, all of that, the countries of origin, all of that information is the starting point. And actually companies struggle with that in some cases. Before you start then going down to, what's the farming practice and are they tilling and, what are they feeding the livestock on and all of that, which is going to come in time.
Yeah.
But it's getting people in a place where they can see that journey ahead of them and how they can get there in the long run.
I think it was on one of the Future Food Movement talks or something that I was on. There was a really interesting statistic about the fact that we have all these conversations, but actually, and while you were talking, just remind me, when I was asking some of these questions that were really difficult to get hold of, there was a part of me that was thinking, I feel a bit bad, like asking these questions. They don't know the answer. And they're getting a bit funny with me, asking, trying to get this information. And I thought, hang on a minute, like, as a society, we need to know where our food is coming from. This is not an unreasonable question. And because the food industry has become so big, we've kind of lost touch with some of that piece at the farming point. And something like 75% of farms are these individually owned, like very small farms, because they're like part of cooperatives and stuff. And it was that sort of information that I found really useful, that you can get that information, but you have to keep digging. But it is a very time consuming, very big process. But I think when I'm involved in these conversations where we're talking about, how are we going to change the health and sustainability of the products that we produce? The only way to do it is to interrogate the information as much as we can and put tools in place that make it easier for the people, at the coalface of product development, making the products, because that's the only way, as you were saying, David, that we can provide the information to then say, what do you want to do about this? Because this is going to have the biggest impact, but it's going to cost this, or the cost impact isn't going to be this great because we can offset it against this. It opens up so many conversations, doesn't it?
Whether it's a customer or whether it's a consumer, I think this giving them the information to make an informed decision is all we're really trying to do in the short term. And to Will's point, we can do that with our first party data. We can get to a view across all the complete products as to what actions we could take on those products that we currently produce to reduce their impact. But also what, again, to your point, Lucy, they'd still need to be delicious. Like I wouldn't be doing my colleague Matt McCullough any justice if I wasn't talking about deliciousness throughout everything we produce. Because consumers just aren't going to come back and buy if it doesn't taste good. But there has to be a balance there. And I'm a firm believer that there is a need for reformulation in this, but there's also a need for new exciting ranges that tap into, particularly on the plant-based trends and kind of more plants. You've seen the stuff that M&S have been doing this week on this cornflake has got one ingredient. Like that stuff is really powerful. Because I completely agree, we have entirely lost the connection with where our food comes from. And although this isn't necessarily going to help that in the short term, you can see how if you can give the customers and the consumers the ability to make an informed choice at shelf or online, it helps that kind of get that narrative. And I think the longer term ambition is how you tie in the sustainability piece with health. And actually, you can then start talking about nutrient density and all those kind of topics, which are really difficult to get together. But the exciting thing in the short term is we can make some really big changes now, small things, but at volume that can really reduce the impact of emissions globally.
Yeah. And that's the point, isn't it? A business the size of Compleat, like you said, it's nearly £1 billion turnover. This is by making these changes, you can, much as we have lost touch, there are big players in the market that can do something to help with that.
And it's brilliant that work is being done. And, I think, because I know you've had a real positive response from customers, haven't you, David, in terms of what you're doing? So how far along are you with this project? Because I know it sounds like, I think you've done it quite quickly, considering how difficult it is. And I've seen it, and I was lucky enough to have a little play on the Recipe Professor module, and it's really easy to use, and it makes it, it's whizzy. So it's very exciting.
Yeah, we just try and present it just as it's another output alongside the cost, alongside the labelling deck, alongside the nutrition, the claims, and everything else that's important to consumers and your customers. And the data goes across, it comes back, and we get the breakdown then of what the impact looks like, looking across something like 16 different impact scores. So it's not just carbon and greenhouse emissions, it's land use, biodiversity, it's ecotoxicity, it's a number of different things that are all ranked together and distilled into a label, into a score, into a green or red. And then it's a breakdown of what's driving into that, which materials are your highest impacting materials. And that's great on an individual product level. You can still make decisions, you can still play with alternatives. But when you get to the scale now that we're getting to, where we've taken 3,000, 4,000 SKUs and sent them across and had that analysis over the whole lot done, which is something, like 5,000 ingredients and a number of other, maybe even 3,000 sub-recipes and subcomponents. And suddenly you can see that picture for the first time as a group and start to then look at those easy wins, maybe something that's quite easy from a labeling deck point of view that you can swap out, that an individual product makes a small impact, but across the group, you're talking some huge numbers because of the volumes you're plugging through and the number of products that those sort of ingredients can go into. So it's that where it's really powerful. And then you can feed that back into your design teams. And the way that, David's got this access to that kind of group level data and can kind of inform the design process, but then the chefs then have got those tools on an individual product basis on, when they're doing their modeling and different scenario planning and that sort of thing. So it's the combination of the two lenses, which is really powerful, I think.
Yeah.
But it's immensely complicated. Like we've been doing this for over 2 years now to get to this point, and still now there's a lot of integration and fine tuning needed to make sure that we get one accurate data going into Recipe Professor to begin with that represents all of the products that Compleat either produce or bring into our business through the outsourced production model we have. And then making sure we're mapping that correctly, because the fields that we've got within Recipe Professor don't necessarily align with exactly what we need for doing an LCA. There's a lot of it does, but just getting the nuts and bolts between the two systems working is complicated, in particularly when you've got a business like Compleat that is growing, expanding, is currently 6 different legacy businesses all working together, trying to achieve a common kind of one complete aim. It adds a level of complication. But I think to Will's point, we're really close now to getting that baseline done, which says for all the products that we can put through Recipe Professor into Sustained, what does that tell us as a complete business? Like, where are those wins? Where are those categories? Where are those ingredients even, packaging that we should be focusing on? And then you can start to take it out to brands, so our own brands. And the really exciting thing for me is, and this is where the customers, the retailers have got excited, is we can then start to talk to them at a product level. And I would love the end goal for this to be we start getting briefed back by customers on how do we reduce the impact of their products over time. Because at the moment we might get a brief that's got, let's lower salt, let's lower fat, let's improve recycled content and packaging. That's pretty much about it across the piece. Nobody's talking about environmental impact or reducing food waste or reducing emissions. But once you've got the visibility of the data, you can start to make those tangible changes. And that for me is the really exciting thing.
Yeah. And it's probably not happening because they're going through similar journeys themselves to work out, what their line in the sand is and how they're going to improve things. But I'm sure there'll be some retailers listening thinking, we need to be getting on the front foot of this, because ultimately we know that things have got to change. And in this, me and Lucy always talk about, like, we started in the industry 25 years ago, and it was, it was salt, it was clean deck. Then it was like, we need to, a fat, salt, sugar. It's the next thing that really, really has got to be delivered, hasn't it?
Well, it's like the perfect storm with UPFs and sustainability. It's like, it's really overwhelming. And I was going to ask you, David, how, because there are so many different touch points, and you sort of immediately think about carbon, but you mentioned water and there's biodiversity. And do you as a business decide this is what we're going to focus on, or is it a holistic view, or how does that work? Because that also becomes confusing for manufacturers when they're supplying own label, because different retailers might have different targets for different things. And how do you navigate that?
That's a really good question. I think one that we certainly haven't got right yet. I think a lot of it comes down to getting to that point in time. Like we could do it now, but we actually want to try and wait until we've really got, with the information on point 74 in Recipe Professor, the data from our side as accurate as possible. And then we can do that baseline and we can start to unpick some of those categories. I think the biggest impact is going to be climate change. That's going to be the single biggest challenge. And even before we started this process, I could have almost foreseen that the biggest change we can make in our business is moving away from animal-based proteins to plant-based proteins. Like that in a topic is a big one, but it's really complicated to try and do. So that kind of nudge mentality of making something delicious, but also increasing more pulses, lentils, those kind of ingredients into our products. Now, there's been some good examples of this, but not many in the past, where you can take a product that doesn't contain any plant-based ingredients and bring them in, and you still got a delicious product at the end of it. So whether that's mushrooms or pulses, as I said, but most of them just end up not tasting very good. So I think there's going to be a bit of a balance there, which is we are a food business. Our motto is we make food that when people eat it, they feel good about it. Mm-hmm. That has to be at the center of everything Compleat do.
Yeah.
However, I think there's a way in which we can gradually, even if it's 1-2% within recipes, if you were suddenly kind of to swap out that percentage of pork in a pork pie and bring in lentils, pulses, that 2% over 200 million pork pies that we produce a year, suddenly you've got massive scale and impact. But we aren't quite there yet, Lucy, in that we haven't been able to say, well, actually, which is more important. I think it'll come down to individual products, individual ingredients, and also packaging. Some of the work we did in the proof of concept with Sustain threw up some interesting things on packaging, for example, that we hadn't necessarily thought about. But generally, it's like to Will's point, it is the ingredients, it's the protein we purchase where the biggest impact is.
Yeah.
All right, folks, we're going to take a quick breather here to hear from our fantastic sponsors. They help keep the podcast going, so don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. As we all know, the food industry never stands still, and it's not getting any easier. More pressure, tighter deadlines, and endless spreadsheets. Sound familiar? Point 74 is the perfect solution for cutting through today's product development challenges, enabling teams to create, cost, comply, and collaborate with ease. Used by 1 in 5 of the UK's top food manufacturers and 2 of the top 5 retailers, it's the software behind the label of your favourite food products, delivering improved quality, margins, and processes, all in one seamless system.
Ensuring food safety and quality is crucial. That's why businesses trust Microsearch Laboratories, part of the IFP Labs Group. UKAS-accredited Microsearch offers microbiological, nutritional and allergen testing for food, drink and water, delivering fast results and expert support. With over 30 years of experience, trusted by leading manufacturers and retailers, and a commitment to sustainability, Microsearch is your partner in product safety. Visit micro-search.co.uk to learn more.
And we're back. Thanks for sticking with us. Let's dive right back in.
And on that packaging side, I mean, that's another thing that we also do is we capture the packaging specification information, based around the EPR regulations so that we can, from a product lens, tell you the recyclable content and the sustainability of the packaging in the finished product and really help you with that level of reporting. And again, getting all this data together, it's not just about doing the environmental footprint of an individual product. It's all the other sort of sustainability schemes and other requirements that food manufacturers also have to answer, which typically they spend a lot of time, with consultants and third parties, and it all comes in certain reporting periods and really disruptive to the business to try and suddenly run around grabbing data and trying to find all that information together. So again, having it on one place, it all feeds into the same thing. And I think that's a really key point of what we're trying to achieve is just taking out a lot of that noise and making it easier, because the asks are getting harder. There's more and more of these things. There's not less, so it's only going to get worse. And I think if you're not prepared for that, then life's going to be very difficult for you, and you're going to be, putting a lot of people at it. So
yeah, it is very labour intensive pulling it all together, isn't it? And so, Will, from a 0.74 perspective, obviously there's this sustained add-on and is that because the Compleat Food Group were using sustained data? So what I'm asking is, if another company is using a different set of data, is there a way of integrating different data?
Yeah, so obviously the big challenge is sort of the methodological alignment. At the moment, different companies are not aligned in terms of the methodologies and the calculation processes. And that's because, in absence of any kind of government regulation or any kind of agreement there or steer, the industry's kind of making it up as they go along and trying to sort of self-govern to some degree and, doing the best it can to do that. And so we've already got that. We've got other customers. So we've got some customers who use the My in food service, who use the My Emissions platform. and we've worked with them as well. We're remaining agnostic because we kind of have to. And they've all got strengths and weaknesses. Other customers using Mundra, and we've been helping them get data out. We haven't got the sort of level of integration that we've got with Sustained and My Emissions yet, but maybe in the future we will have. But at some point, all of these systems will align around a single methodology. They need to, really, for clarity for consumers. And so it's not confusing. If two companies are giving a very different score for the same product, it can lead to bad incentives. It at both ends. It can affect the benefit downstream to the farmers and the growing. It can also affect the consumer and, whether they start worrying about greenwashing or losing credibility. So it's absolutely key that we do align around something which has real credibility and is going to lead to good outcomes at both ends of that value chain. And I think that's what we're really trying to drive with the product. So we're remaining agnostic. At the moment, they're all quite different. They've got quite different focuses. Some are more about the labeling, and food service organizations are already being quite brave in some cases and putting labels on products, which is great, because that is driving consumer behavior. And I think retailers are quite scared to do that at the moment because they don't feel ready, probably for good reason. But I think it'll come. I think it will come. And that's when we'll start to see people have the information they need to make decent product choices. And then that'll filter down. And then the farms that are doing well, hopefully, will be the ones that are more sustainable and doing things correctly. And you get that virtuous circle. And that's what we've got to kind of aim for.
Yeah. And David, I remember when we had a pre-record chat, we were talking about scannable codes on packaging so that the ESG data can be updated. And that's a bit of a lower risk way of doing it than printing it on, isn't it? Because it is really difficult that there's not a standard.
Well, yeah, it is. And I think Will is absolutely right. But I think the positive news is that is being looked at. So ever since Henry Dimbleby published the National Food Strategy a few years ago, the government have not taken everything on board, but they've taken a few things on board. And one of the positive things was the launch of the Food Data Transparency Partnership just over 18 months ago now, which I'm lucky to be part of. And its aim is to get that methodological alignment and make sure that everyone is calculating it in the same way from farm to fork. So that is coming. And I think whilst there's a huge amount of work going on that at the moment, whilst that's happening, it shouldn't stop us doing this work. I think I've been saying this within our business, and I've been saying that to my suppliers. I don't mind who's been doing what in the background. If you've got a product carbon footprint, you've got carbon data, get it into me, because we want to use that to improve the accuracy of our conversations. And I think it links really nicely back to the point Will made around the consumer is ultimately this is going to get onto a pack. It's going to be something, well, it's already happening in Europe. So Europe have already mandated this. It is coming into the UK. There are some great examples out there already. So you mentioned My Emissions, that's more food service aligned. You've got Foundation Earth that have got eco-labels on packs. There's been some great work done. And I think the challenge that the sector faces is the same with nutritional labeling. And my background's technical, so I used to do specs, used to do artwork. Okay. That was my bread and butter. It is complicated because if you think about the flow we've got with Sustainable 74 is we're taking it bottom up. So anything that we change on Recipe Professor will flow up into a retailer spec system, into an Oracle-based platform or whatever it is, and potentially change the recipe of that product. And it might not be something that's a legal change that needs to prompt an artwork, but actually from an LCA perspective, it might be important. So if we change a country of origin of ingredient, it's probably going to update the LCA. And that would be tantamount to normally you'd have a label update, but we're not going to be in a position where that is something we can handle as a sector. Just kind of managing complexities on labels kind of anyway is difficult.
Well, then it starts to link into supply chain, food security, all of those things, doesn't it? Actually, absolutely. There are times where we have to swap ingredients at short notice and stuff like that. It's not simple.
Yeah. So I think the whole kind of labeling infrastructure in the UK, if I think about food information regulations, which was something we all went through many years ago, that's there for a specific reason. I think we need to come up with a methodology to keep LCA information live and up to date. And to Will's point, kind of credible, because if you don't have that credibility with the consumers, that they just lose that confidence entirely. So I think the QR code linking something into a barcode on pack that doesn't need to change the artworks on the product is absolutely the direction of travel. And it's something that the Food Data Transparency Partnership is actively looking at the moment, which I think is really exciting. And if you then take this one step further, I think how you would then link in nutritional labeling at the same time and get this broad, healthy, sustainable diets piece, you can see how the consumer will get the information in one place in a consistent, credible way, where they can then make that informed choice.
Yeah.
And you can certainly imagine that future where you go onto your online shopping grocery platform and you choose sustainable products, and that it takes into account things like seasonality and the health of the food, and you're asking the AI to find you your basket of food for this week, and it's it's got the recipes and it's chosen the ingredients, and off you go. That's where we can get to in a few years' time, and I think it will come faster than people think. Because it's such an appealing consumer proposition.
It is. Yeah. I think you're absolutely right, Will. And I think it's like ripe for it, isn't it? But it's so, it's that I think the consumer doesn't really know what's needed to get to there. They don't really know, they say they want to do things more sustainably. They say they want to be healthier. However, they make the choices based on taste. Like, we know that.
And we always have that conversation of like, if your kids want strawberries and it's out of season, you just do it because you want your kids to shut up. Like that's the reality. That's the day-to-day reality, isn't it?
But I think when labelling comes in, that will start to change, because that was the example that I used, that when I became more mindful of it, I was like, why am I buying strawberries? Like, this is ridiculous. Like, I know what the and so the more information that we can provide to consumers, the easier those decisions become for them. And so the easier it becomes for us to make those changes and have those challenging conversations. So it's getting everybody moving in the same direction. But I think you're right, Will. I think it will start to happen really quite quickly.
The slightly mad thing about this is I think we all know that sourcing local in season is the right thing to do. And probably the end of this is going to be just telling us exactly that, just with more science behind it. Like, we're almost going to go full circle, right? I'm not saying we all kind of get on a good life and start doing our own allotments and things, but that's essentially where it's going to tell us is better, local, high quality, probably less protein, but better protein, more plant-based ingredients, pulses, lentils, mushrooms. But because we've spent the last 30, 40 years getting particularly the UK food sector to where it is now, convenient, really cheap, kind of good value products, it's very difficult to change that overnight. And the bit that I'm concerned about, a little bit worried about, is because the science is still evolving, and whether it just be climate, that science is really complicated, because you've got some really great work going on in the dairy sector, which, to be honest, if you look at it right now from an emissions point of view, we should be eating less dairy. But when you start to layer in nutrition into that, it suddenly becomes a much more nuanced conversation, is how you, with that complexity, get that message across to the consumer in a way that they can trust it. Because you'll go one week to the next and there'll be bacon's really good for you, bacon's really bad for you, red wine, like red wine's great, chocolate's great, red wine and chocolate are bad. Like the consumer doesn't really know what they're supposed to be doing. So I think having that government backing, like regardless of what many of us probably think about government, I think they have an opportunity across the UK food system where you take in the NHS and the health and nutrition of a nation, and then food and labelling and farming all the way through to do something that is joined up, constructive, and comes with its own layer of credibility. I think that's where you start to really drive the change, if you've got that kind of credibility behind.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think there's an element of like regaining trust from consumers, so they know that as an industry we're doing the responsible thing. And so if you can buy dairy because it's been sourced responsibly, and it's building that trust back up, isn't it?
Well, I'm rewarding the people who are doing that, the companies that are investing in making their products lower, because there's a lot of meat that can be reduced massively, the emissions of it, by certain livestock practices, and most farmers just aren't aware of those practices and aren't incentivized to do things in the right way. So we've got to get to a point where they are, because it is about eating more plant-based food, but it is also about recognizing the number of people won't be doing that. So how do we still take that rest of the food production into the right direction and grow food where it's most, it's not always about buying local. It's about where, because food's grown in some weird places just because it's cheap labor, or just because there's lots of sunshine or whatever, and it's seemingly we've got endless amounts of water, though we haven't. And your example in Spain was quite good for that. But in some parts of the world, it makes a lot more sense to grow stuff because the natural resources for that particular type of thing are so much more efficient. You hear stories around, that lamb from New Zealand can be better in some cases than lamb more locally, because it's such a rich environment for the animals to grow up in. They use less input food stuff. So I think it's a difficult conversation, and it's going to take us time to fully unwind and inform the people throughout, both ends, consumers and farmers.
And it is very complex because of things like that, because it doesn't make any sense, but actually because of intensive farming and shipping, carbon emission, there's so many different factors, aren't there?
Yeah. And it kind of makes your head explode a little bit, which is why it's great that there is something like that you're building into Recipe Professor, because I think that's the thing. And we talk to people all the time, particularly in product development, where it's like, there's just so many factors that I'm having to worry about. And we're hopefully, helping to not get rid of one of those factors, but using a system and a way of simplifying it a little bit.
Yeah, that is so important, because I think new product development people are at the center of everything, really, when it comes to, new products. And it's just a very challenging place to be. There are more and more of these requirements coming in. And also it's such a competitive market with such short time frames to do the development process in. And, if you don't know what the operational labor is going to be, or you haven't got accurate allergen information or supply chain information, it can be so expensive to make those mistakes and find out later, by which point you've committed to prices, you've committed to labeling, and you've now got those awkward conversations. And it can really affect your confidence when dealing with, putting forward your submissions. Can I stand behind this? We've rushed this together. Am I actually confident? If you've got confidence when you go into those conversations, it really shows. And I think that's commercially advantageous to food businesses. So it's about empowering chefs and empowering people to be having those conversations with, and they can stand behind them and they understand, and they've got the tools to spend exploring and doing the what if, rather than just trying to gather all the bits of paper together and desperately hoping that they've got it right.
I think the word empowering is true. Like I want to empower my MPD colleagues, my technical colleagues, my commercial colleagues with something that is incredibly complicated that we can make relatively simple through a lens on Recipe Professor. And I think that gives us information that then enables the conversations to be a bit more detailed when we have them with our customers. And I think we've still got to bridge the gap between that level of knowledge on both sides of that relationship, whether it be in our own business or whether it be with our customers and other partners, because it's great us doing all of this work, but if it's not kind of receptive on the other side. And I think I very much see my role as being bringing those businesses together. I think it's probably because I've come from retail and also manufacturing backgrounds. There's a disconnect, like we said earlier, between where those kind of commercial realities are on a day-to-day basis versus kind of what we probably all should and know we should be doing. So I absolutely want to then share that data on both sides. And I see it as my role as kind of getting our business, whether it be NPD, technical, commercial, ESG, into the same room as those equivalents, plus the sustainability context that I have. Because actually, like, the sustainability teams really struggle to articulate some of the stuff that they want to try and do to the rest of their own organizations. So but you, like to Will's point, you can't really do it unless you've got the data you can trust.
But there is definitely something in that. And I think you'll probably have people contacting you, David, that are listening to this podcast, because I think with so many of these things, I think the industry needs to come together, doesn't it? That we all need to work together towards these things. And actually, when you're pulling in different directions and using different methodologies and all of that stuff, it doesn't help the greater good. And ultimately, when we're talking about ESG, it really flipping matters. It matters, to our children, our grandchildren, everything.
It does. And I don't mind saying, I didn't plan to be the group head of ESG at Compleat. I was a technical manager and have been doing that role probably happily for over 15 years in retail and manufacturing, but I had the opportunity to pivot into the world of ESG 3 years ago, and I didn't know whether I'd be any good at it. Like, I didn't know what scope 1, 2 or 3 were this time 3 years ago. Now that I'm leading a nearly 1.2 billion turnover business, I'm suddenly an industry expert. But the bit that I can bring to that is, although you'd never really think of it at the time, but my experience of food manufacturing, understanding logistics, supply chain, what those levers we can pull in various organizations, is actually made me a better kind of ESG leader. And I think if I look at some of my sustainability colleagues in other businesses that have just been sustainability focused, they're looking at me going, how are you doing all this? I'm like, well, all I'm doing is kind of using the experience I've got and joining the dots to have some of these conversations, because I can see it from both sides of the fence. Now, that doesn't necessarily make it the solution, but it's enabling different conversations that haven't really happened before.
Yeah, it helps move things forward, doesn't it? Because you're just asking the right people the right questions and starting the conversations.
Yeah, like one of the things that we've been trying to look at, and it's been a discussion point for nearly 2 years now, is that flow of information. So we're doing the work at the moment with Recipe Professor on our own products. We develop them at Compleat. Currently, we then manually type that information into a retailer spec platform. With the LCA information, the logical thing to do would be to take that automatically from the Recipe Professor system and flow it straight up with the LCA embedded in it up into that retailer spec platform So then you've got one data input from our side, you get it accurate first time round, and then you build the APIs to go directly from one to the other, and you get that flow through. You can see how you'd evolve quite quickly the way we've worked and developed over the last kind of 20 years with specs and artworks and that kind of stuff, but just bring this flow into it. Because I've been a technical manager at a retailer, I've done specs on both retail and manufacturing. They're not always that accurate. I'd love to say it that they're always accurate 100% of the time. They're just not. And actually, if you start to change the flow, you can improve that accuracy and then ultimately make better decisions from it.
Yeah. And take out labour intensiveness. Like, it's crazy, isn't it, really?
I was going to say, there's a reason that it's not accurate, and that's that, the people element that has to go on in between. Actually, we can take that out.
There's
I used to write specs, like I used to be when I was a technologist on the other side, and I was the one submitting things that were inaccurate because my brain wasn't right for doing that work. But actually, if there'd been a system that could bypass my brain, that would have been perfect.
And it's stressful, right? We've all been there when we don't have the information and we're giving it to a customer like, have you actually done the shelf life on this? Have you actually done the nutritionals? No, we probably haven't, but here it is anyway. I think having that built into the process just makes it so much simpler, especially when you think about it long term and go, if we're going to have this eco label on the product, we need to build this system behind it. A bit like when we put multiple traffic lights onto packaging for nutrition, we had to build that. It took a long time to get that cross retailer agreement on the methodology. Admittedly, it's voluntary, but if you do the voluntary thing, you've then got to follow the mandatory guidelines. To get that alignment took a long, long time. But once we got there, everyone was clear. And that's kind of what drives the artware process at the moment. We need that same kind of process and change for LCA information and product level information.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, because we get asked, first question we get asked when we go to a new client is, can you talk to the retailer systems? And, ironically, we work with some of the retailers where we do talk to their systems, but so we know there's an integration possible there, but they don't expose them outwardly to customers. So you do have this situation where the art of the possible, it's definitely possible. And we spend a lot of time trying to help people do that in there's some import facilities and there's some other things we can do to speed that up. But ultimately the barrier is there in terms of they don't open up those APIs. They haven't standardized some of the really easy to standardize things. Retailers don't even agree on what countries are called around the world. They have different setups for the countries. So when we do that, we have to have mappings for different country names because we can't get that alignment on that. And, there is a real need to, whilst recognizing retailers all want to have their own special thing, that they do something better and than another retailer and they want to ask those extra questions, surely we can align around some of the basics, like what countries are costing, how a recipe spec should look like, what an LCA should look like, what traffic lights need to look like, because it would take a lot of friction out. In Australia, they have the PIF standard, a government legislated standard spec. Retailers still going above and beyond that, but at least the core data, once you've done it once, you can share it. I mean, the amount of people in the food industry, and we're dealing with tier one manufacturers mainly. You go further, you go down, the more different spec systems, different formats, non-standardizations going on. And it's no wonder the data is 2 years out of date and no one can struggle to update a spec for 2 or 3 years because it's so hard to do that, and it's such an art.
Yeah. I can tell it's a real passion of yours. I'm like, if there's any retailers listening, talk to Will.
I would love to talk to you. I would love to talk to you about how we can get through this.
I just think in general, I always say, like, the food industry feels so far behind from a technology perspective. Like, I understand why, but we are so far behind on, compared to other industries.
This is a slightly controversial point, but I've made it a few public forums and things, so I might saying it again, but I think one of the challenges we have in this, particularly a broad kind of sustainability food system, is the Competition Marketing Authority. I think there's genuinely a bit of a challenge there with, yes, we need to be not anti-competitive, we need to be doing it in the right way, but when it comes to sustainability, I think there are some barriers that really stop proper collaboration. And I think there's an opportunity with this to do something a bit more joined up that is for the greater good and not even to be anti-competitive. And I think if we started to tackle that, you might see a bit more moving, because businesses, to Will's point earlier, are just kind of nervous and concerned about greenwashing. And I think with some of those barriers, and I've had various conversations in various forums about this, I think it's difficult to get some true collaboration, some true collective action with some of the barriers that kind of would be deemed currently anti-competitive, but actually are just trying to drive everyone in a consistent way forward to do things in the right way.
Yeah, it's a really good point.
Yeah. Start somewhere small. The LCAs is a great opportunity, and it needs to be standardized. So let's start in that space and then expand out. And I think that that's going to be needed throughout the supply chain as well, because again, that farmer who's done all the hard work of doing all the right practices and has got the data to back it up needs to be able to share that and get the benefit for it. Otherwise, it won't be the right incentives there. So, and this is perhaps even a bigger thing than just the UK. Perhaps there's some kind of global agreement needed. Otherwise, you've got the same. The supply chain is global, so it's we're not all going to be just buying our food locally.
Yeah, well, it is a complex area. And, thank you so much, David, for coming on and talking so openly about what you're doing at Compleat, because, you could keep your cards very close to your chest and not talk about it, but we all do need to do something in the food industry because it's coming. So, thank you very much for being so open and talking about it. And I think Amy's right. Lots of people will be really interested, and your LinkedIn inbox might be filling up. And Will, thank you for talking about Point 74 and the brilliant software and what it can do, because it's I'm a big fan. It opens up so many possibilities. So really, really interesting.
What is the best way for people to get in touch with you, Will, if they want to talk more?
Well, obviously there's the website. So there's a great way of getting in touch with us to go onto the website. There's materials on there, and you can contact us, and we can share with you sort of pods where you can explore the software and the different module offerings that we have in more detail. So please do look there first. Probably as the first point of call, and or you can email us at sales@point74.co.uk. You can ring the office. You can send me an email. There's a million ways of getting in touch with us. You can just look at our LinkedIn profile, etc. So, please do get in touch, because if any of this has resonated with you today and you are sat there thinking, I could really do with a system that can help me get that through this, we'd be great to talk with you. There's a range of different price points that we can offer the software at, depending on, your budgets and the modules that you want. So please come and talk to us, and particularly around the environmental design module. If you're already a customer and you haven't got it and you want to get it, you're in a good place to retake that quite quickly. So,
David's done all the hard work with them to get it somewhere.
Thanks, David, for that. Yeah.
Fabulous. Thank you both so much for coming on. I think it's been a really interesting conversation. I do think you're going to get lots of messages from lots of people interested to hear more.
Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, thanks very much. And
we'll see everyone else next time.
We'll see you next time. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it, rate and review us. It really helps us reach more food industry pros like you.
For more resources, head over to our website, overfoodsake.co.uk, and join our mailing list to stay in touch.
And if you'd like to connect with us, come say hello on LinkedIn. We're both there, Lucy Wager and Amy Wilkinson.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.